Manning here. Welcome to an afternoon Garden Report. Talking Sixers. Why not? Today, all of us woke up shocked. I know Adam, I saw his reaction waking up this morning, seeing what happened in China. I guess overnight, where we are on the East Coast. He he basically went right at Daryl Morey and turned this trade request, which had kind of been sleepy and even going dormant, according to the recent reporting just before this. And then now it's on fire, heading into training camp next month. Adam Aaronson writes Ricky Sanchez Podcast, and me to have him on here for a minute. No better time than now, Adam, huh?
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So, what do you make of this? Where do things stand, you think, now that Harden pulled this card?
Yeah, so when the Sixers leaked to Woj a few days ago, we've never had traction on a deal. We're going to go into training camp with Harden on the team. I expected that Harden would somehow try to escalate the situation. This was not exactly what I had in mind. But it's a tricky spot there and now, obviously. But the overarching question that I keep thinking is just who is trading for James Harden? He wanted to go to the Clippers, despite the Clippers having like 7 different viable role players with medium-sized salaries that they could put together for Harden. There was never anything close on. There was never any traction with the Clippers or anyone else all summer. And if it's not them, who is the team that is excited about trading for 34-year-old James Harden after this saga and after the last 2 games of his playoff run, where for the second year in a row, he kind of went out in embarrassing fashion. So I just don't know who actually makes sense. And I don't know if Harden understands that. I think he could still be kind of in the mindset that he was in when he was, one of the 5 best players in the NBA. But he's not that guy anymore, which he knows. But I don't think he's actually acting with that mindset. And I think he greatly misread what the market for him was going to be if he thought he could opt into that contract and then instantly be traded. That's just not the case.
And I'll throw in the last 2 exits from his previous 2 teams, certainly.
Yeah, it's the exact same playbook.
So that adds to, I think, the hesitancy around the league to add him, plus the fact that you have to deal with his next contract negotiation a summer from now, and you can't sign an extension immediately if you trade for him. That's where the Clippers sat. So there's a lot of things working against him being traded at this point. But if we're going to take it a few steps back to where this stood a few weeks ago, or maybe a month ago now, where he opts in, they say, yeah, we'll, work with you on a trade here. And you also hear, if you do come back, though, if we run this whole team back, we're a championship contender. And I agree with what you said, that Harden's not that guy anymore. Like, he's at a different stage of his career. He's heading in the wrong direction as a player. I haven't been the biggest fan of Harden throughout his career for a number of different reasons. And I generally haven't been the biggest believer in this Philly core. I mean, I don't know what I picked the Celtics over in them in that series, probably like 5 or something. I think I might have even picked the sweep. And then he comes out with one of his better playoff games ever in game 1.
So good.
I think, what was it, the game 5, he had 40 as well?
Games 1 and 4. So basically, games 1 and 4, he was like unbelievably good. Game 5, he was good.
Every other game, 3-2 lead.
Yeah, every other game of the series, he looked like one of the worst players in NBA history.
Right.
It was unbelievable.
But if we're just talking about this team dynamic right now, and then you throw the Embiid injury that he was dealing with through that series too, they had Boston. They did. 3-2 lead, midway through game 6 as well. They're in a good spot. And then who knows what happens in these finals against the Heat. I think they'd probably be favorites in that series. So if you just take a few steps back from all the frustration he's feeling, all the frustration the city's feeling after that loss, and whatever frustration remains between him and the contract negotiations. If they just run this back and see what happens after this year, it could go pretty well, I think. Like, they still have a really good team here. They have a pretty good coach coming in. I think things might be weird between Nurse and Harden, but I actually, looking at what they did last year, like this team a little bit more than I did going into the series between the Celtics and Philly, despite them losing it. And there's no situation for anyone involved here with a trade, I think, that makes any of their situations better, whether it's Morey, whether it's Embiid, whether it's Harden.
Yeah, I mean, it was a really good team last year. Like you said, they almost took down a very good team, and they would have been favored against the Heat the same way the Celtics were. It's my main question is, what version of Harden is it? So, like, even if, let's say, Harden was happy to come back, he talked to the front office. He said, "Okay, I'll play out this 1 year on my player option, and we'll see what happens afterwards." And he came in good faith, which is not what's happening. But if that is what it was. He's 34 years old. Last year, he expected that he was about to get a contract that he did not end up getting. Last year, he missed, I believe, more games than he ever has in a season. And then he kind of went out sad in the playoffs again. And between the pretty significant decline that he's had over the last few years, and of course, he's still a great player because that's how good he was before his athleticism started to kind of get zapped. He's a tremendous player. But again, like I said, I think completely misread the situation. But back to the original point, even if he did come back in good faith and see what happens for a year, he's like almost certainly not going to be as good as he was last year. And he was fantastic in the regular season when he played. I think he gave them about 20 and 10. I think he led the league in assists per game. He's obviously great. But he's also part of the reason that they didn't get past the second round again.
Yeah. Game 7 was just awful.
Yeah. And they don't, game 1, he almost single-handedly carried them to a win against the Celtics. Game 4, I wouldn't call it single-handedly, but he was the best player on the floor. And yet, even with like those things going in his favor in the biggest spot, it became a disaster. And so even if he came back, like I said, and in good faith, I don't know why this team is any better than last year's team. Embiid is coming off a career season. It's always like, an MVP caliber year, averaging, 32, 33 a game, whatever it was, is not easily repeatable. PJ Tucker's turning 39. Tobias Harris, there's no reason to believe is at any point going to get better than where he is right now. Really, the only piece from last year's team where it's like reasonable to expect them to be better next season is Tyrese Maxey. But as good as he is, and he's a tremendous player, if you're asking him to be the second best guy on a team, you're just not real championship contenders. That's just at 22, 23 years old. That's just not a reasonable expectation for Maxey, who has shattered just about all expectations. But that, even for him, is just too lofty of a goal, I think. And so maybe this is more pessimistic than it needs to be, but my initial mindset is, well, if they came up short last year, what is putting them over what is getting them over that hump this year? With all due respect to 34-year-old Patrick Beverley and, to Mo Bamba, who's probably going to be their third string center, it doesn't seem to me like they added anything or we'll see enough internal improvement that gets them over the hump against a team like they always kind of view the Celtics as a measuring stick, I think, just because of how many times they've lost to the Celtics in the playoffs. And obviously the Celtics thing being spearheaded by Tatum is something that is always kind of a tough pill to swallow for people here.
Yeah. And you throw into that the coach that I always wondered how he and Harden would mesh, given how Nurse wants his teams to play, the defense emphasis and all of that. would have been intrigued to see how that would go, those two paired together, because if we believe the reporting on Harden and Doc, Harden started turning his head sideways toward Doc at the end, and that's a big reason Doc's out of here. So for him to not be committed to this situation anymore after pulling those strings adds to, I think, the tension of the situation.
Absolutely. I apologize cutting you off, but I just think that's a great point, because I think if it wasn't the biggest reason, James Harden's relationship with Doc was one of the biggest reasons that he was fired.
Yeah.
Doc Rivers is flawed. People here basically resented him from day one. And to be fair, he didn't really ever do or say much to endear himself to the fan base. He clearly has, tendencies that can be annoying to watch over the course of an 82-game season. But they did not lose those last, 6 quarters against the Celtics so dreadfully because of Doc Rivers. It was not because Doc Rivers early in the season liked Montrezl Harrell more than Paul Reed. And it's not because he didn't give Isaiah Joe a chance to be a rotation player. They lost because their players didn't play well enough. And I think people love in sports, especially fans, to say in any sport, oh, well, the coach or the manager, they got to can that guy and then things will make more sense. Because it's much easier to say that and be like, okay, one guy in, one guy out, than to be like, maybe this team is fundamentally flawed.
Yeah. And there's a premium on stars too. That's the next.
I just think that's where the Sixers are. I wonder if they knew if this is what was going to happen with Harden, if they still would have fired Doc. I think Nurse is a slight upgrade over Doc. I think most coaches don't have that much of an impact in the aggregate unless you're really, really good or really, really bad. And I think they're both kind of in that middle area. I think Nurse is probably slightly better, and I think it's good to get a new voice once every few years. So that's fine. But yeah, I mean, there have just been so many moves made with Harden in mind, that being the biggest one. And now he is adamant that he won't even show up to training camp.
Well, you don't sound very optimistic about next year, and I'll take it another step here and ask probably the biggest question out of all of this. And I'd have to think he'll end up in camp because of the rule that, if he wants to get to free agency, he has to show up and blah, 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 blah. That's been discussed.
Yeah.
But if this thing starts poorly, if there's drama, and if he ends up out of there for a moderate return, something insignificant, is that the beginning of the end of Embiid here? Because he made the comments he did to Maverick Carter.
Yep.
I think there's a expectation there that he wants a second star next to him. I think that's why they went after Harden in the first place, and now why they're holding so firm on trying to get something significant for him now. I think he wants to play with another star next to him. I'm sure he liked playing with Harden, who helped set up his MVP year. There's already a massive load on him in terms of this offense. Could Harden's exit lead almost immediately to Embiid's?
I would not say immediately, but I think it could accelerate that process that I think the Sixers kind of hope, if we never discuss it, it never will happen. But I think if you have a player as good as Embiid, you always have to be thinking about that, regardless of whether they're happy or upset at that time. But this is now the third time that Joel Embiid's best teammate is forcing his way out. It happened with Jimmy Butler, who was perhaps the biggest reason that they almost beat the Raptors in Game 7, a team that ended up winning the title, and they gave them a tougher series than anybody else by far. And then it happens with Ben Simmons a few years ago. It was a little different because there was less frustration about Jimmy's play than there was Ben after the infamous passing up the dunk in Game 7 against the Hawks, and the free throws and the shooting never getting better. And now it's happening here with Harden. If in a span of 5 years or 4 years, 3 top 15 to 30 players at the time all don't want to be on the Sixers anymore, how much longer is Embiid going to want to be on the Sixers? And I also think, who here is like really enticing Embiid to stay? They don't really have. He has good relationships with some of his teammates, obviously, but all of the guys from the process are gone. The coaches that he had when he was a younger player are gone. The front office is gone. It's just a group of people that he doesn't have as much of an emotional attachment towards. And so I'm not saying Embiid is definitely going to request a trade, but I think it's totally on the table as soon as next summer if they don't like really figure out the right plan here. And I don't know what that plan is, because I think the best version of the team next year is if Harden came back. And I also think if Harden came back, I don't think they would get to where they need to be. So again, I know it sounds pessimistic, and it's like you're screwed if you do, you're screwed if you don't. But that might just be where they're in now. They had a few years where it really had to be that time, and I think specifically last year, like the fourth quarter of Game 6 at home, you have the Celtics on the ropes. It was legitimately the loudest I've ever heard that arena in my entire life. I've gone to hundreds of games. It was louder than Boston was in Game 7 when Tatum scored 50-something points. That's how loud
it was. Yeah,
it was unbelievable. The energy in that crowd, and it really felt like that was the moment. And I even felt going into the game, and as you can tell, I'm not always optimistic about the Sixers, but going into that game, it really felt like, Embiid is this. He's due for this like signature game against the Celtics, where he finally puts them away. They exercise the demons, and then it, all of a sudden, a couple bad turnovers. D'Anthony Melton misses a quarter three. Malcolm Brogdon makes one on the other end, and all of a sudden, here we are now. And while I do think Embiid has been, not placated to, for lack of a better word, well enough. He hasn't been supported enough, I suppose. He also should have a lot of ownership here, because he was the one who had one of the worst playoff games of his career in the biggest game of his career in Game 7 against the Celtics.
Yeah.
He's the one who turned the clock back 5 years and got owned by Al Horford again. So I think they have to be worried about Embiid stuff starting pretty soon. I don't think it would be an immediate thing. I would be absolutely stunned if he was not on the team opening night this season. Like, to me, that feels definite.
Yeah.
But opening night 2024-25, I don't know. And that's really what the task is here. It's not the task is solving the Harden situation, but solving the Harden situation very well may be what settles the Embiid situation next year. And they don't want to find themselves in a position they're in now with Harden, or like they were with Simmons, or even like the situation Portland's in now with Damian Lillard, where it's not like he's threatening to hold out yet, but he's trying to take away all of their leverage by saying he only wants to play for the Heat. There's no reason Embiid can't try to do the same thing and limit what they get back because he wants to, force his way somewhere.
That's a good point.
That's kind of a long-winded way of saying everything they do this summer, and even if it goes into training camp or midseason, which is possible, as much as it matters in a vacuum, like each of those moves or trades individually, it all is going to coalesce into a body of work that Embiid is going to evaluate.
And I bet there's no appetite in Philadelphia for trading both, taking that massive step back and going into rebuild mode again. But I do wonder if they ended up handling this somewhat the way Brooklyn did with Irving and Durant, not getting an ideal return for Irving, as Brooklyn didn't, but getting a first and Finney-Smith in the end doesn't look too bad there. And then, as Brooklyn did with Durant, turning Embiid into a massive haul that almost surely looks like it's going to turn into something in the future, wouldn't be the worst result for Philadelphia, especially as if you've described this team doesn't have that massive ceiling right now, especially without a significant return for Harden.
Yeah.
It's not great for a team that waited so long to get to this point and only made the second round through the Embiid era. But I just think, and I've said this before, I've said it about the Heat when they were in a bad spot and they ended up making the finals, but taking that massive step back and going young and going into the draft and getting some like guys like Mikal Bridges back and, what Brooklyn did there, it can turn you around way faster than you think. And I look at Portland right now too. You brought up that example. I think if they hit this Lillard trade right, and it might take some time, it might take some drama and pain, they're going to be back fast with
I'm 1,000%
all these picks. And it's not. I know for fans who are waiting to win a championship, and they've already waited all this time in Philadelphia. It would not be very appeasing to trade both these players. But if you got a ton, you have to think about it, I think.
I will say that
I think about how much the Knicks could give up.
Yeah, there are a lot of people say Negadelphians, like these negative Philly fans.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of them, who think no matter what, the Sixers are already screwed for the rest of time. But I will say, like, as pessimistic as most of what I've said has sounded, they're going to be at the very least a very good team for as long as Embiid is there. If they trade him, if at some point he forces himself out, if that's in a few years from now, let's say, and that happens, as long as they don't, bungle that trade to the level that like Houston did when they traded Harden, and instead of flipping Jared Allen for like a late first round pick and the main player they got back being Victor Oladipo on an expiring deal who they never flipped and then left. They can put themselves in a really good spot to kickstart a rebuild. The same way, like you said, like Portland, obviously you want to always have a player as good as Damian Lillard on your team. But if they can flip him for like really good young players and picks with Anthony Simons, with Scoot Henderson, with Shaedon Sharpe, like you said, they can turn things around pretty quickly. And I think that sentiment almost always applies if you have somebody as good as Embiid is. And again, he's good enough that I think trading him should pretty much always be the absolute last resort. But sometimes you have to be honest with yourself that point has come. And I don't think it has. I definitely don't think that point is now. I'm not sure that point is next year. I don't know exactly when that's going to come. But it's possible because they've been, as far as the long-term outlook, if you just look at like the value of their collection of players and draft picks and financial situation, like their long-term outlook has been trending downward like every year for a while. And some of that has been by design because it increases their short-term potential, which is the kind of risk you take at some point. But like you said, at some point, it's something you have to think about. Again, with Embiid, he's good enough that, I mean, he's the reigning MVP. So you never want to voluntarily be moving someone that good.
Right.
But I do think it is worth pointing out, as pessimistic as I am about their situation right now, that if things do go, as poorly as they possibly can, there will be a light on the other side of the tunnel where they can at least begin a rebuild where they have, quite a significant head start.
Yeah, and it won't be Morey making the call on Embiid, because I think that's the end of him too. Like, he has to make this score work, which complicates it. Want to give a shout out back here on the Garden Report, HelloFresh with a new offer. Love HelloFresh, one of my favorite sponsors we've ever had here on the Garden Report. Just a great way to, and I love cooking to begin with, but if you don't, they make it easy, they make it manageable, and they make it fresh, hence the name. HelloFresh, heading in the fall, is here to help you plan for a busy season for everybody with tasty dishes delivered to your door. Simply choose your recipes, pick your delivery date. There's so much flexibility with HelloFresh. And then lay back and enjoy the last days of good weather and banish the end of summer blues with HelloFresh. Variety. There's a ton of variety here. You can customize your orders. You can pick what you want. There's a bunch of different themes for plans. I'm big on the fish. And all you need is 15 minutes, and you'll be enjoying a tasty, satisfying meal made in your own kitchen. It's great. Prepackaged ingredients, instructions that make it easy, laid out on these placards that they send you. It's all just pre-portioned and ready to go. You just got to follow the instructions and dinner is done. Plus, it's 25% cheaper than takeout and grocery store shopping too. Going out to eat's insane now as well. Like, I can't spend less than $30 going out for a meal. So HelloFresh is the way to go. Love it. Tastes great. Ton of options. So go check out what they have to offer over there. HelloFresh.com/CLNS50 is going to give you 50% off and free shipping when you head over there. That's HelloFresh.com/CLNS50. Make sure you go and use that. Of course, HelloFresh is America's #1 meal kit. HelloFresh.com/CLNS50. One last thing on the Harden stuff, Adam.
Yep.
Is there a sleeper team out there? Obviously, he's focused on the Clippers. They're going to do whatever they can to get the best return. Is there one team out there you're thinking of as you look around, possible packages, possible players, even teams that you think would want to make that 1 year leap on Harden to go all in on next year and then figure it out from there? Like, is there something out there that you can find?
There is. One team that I just haven't, there were like very brief and quiet rumors about, never really turned into anything major, but it always felt interesting to me. And this is going to sound insane given what's on their roster right now, but the Suns could do something that it would be the framework would be Ayton, and I believe it's right. If this were to happen before the season, it would have to be Ayton.
This is the one.
And Ish Wainwright. Those players make it work salary wise. Now, of course, the Sixers are not interested in taking DeAndre Ayton. That does not make sense. So it would have to be at least a 3-team deal, if not a 4-team deal, where the Suns are essentially trading Ayton for Harden, and the Sixers are then trading Ayton to someone, somebody else who's then giving them assets. I don't know if it's going to happen. It's hard to do. It would be much easier to do mid-season just because the Suns have signed so many free agent minimum contracts that almost none of their roster can be moved until December 15th.
Yeah.
It's almost outrageous how what their cap sheet looks like right now. If you look at it, it's really unbelievable. And so I don't know who that Ayton team would be, but like I was saying earlier, it's so hard to think about which teams would have interests in Harden beyond the Clippers. DeAndre Ayton, say what you want about him, but he's a good player and he's very young still, and he has 4 years left on his contract.
I think he's an asset, not a huge one, but I think he is.
I am not an Ayton guy relative to many, but it is much easier to figure out possible trade destinations for a 24, 25-year-old productive player than it is for a 34-year-old declining, injury-prone James Harden who is trying to force a trade for the third time in 4 years.
Right, and you could almost hold the line with that. You empower Maxey. You start to get into the defense. You want to play with Nurse. Maybe I don't think it's an ideal fit, but in the meantime, if you're trying to figure out something with Ayton, maybe Ayton and Embiid can play together and you play big like a lot of the league's starting to here.
It would be very funny because the draft where Ayton went #1, they do these ridiculous NBA comparisons, and they compared Ayton to Embiid, and Embiid tweeted about it like he should play some defense before they compare him to me. And then there was a little bit of I think the first time Ayton played against Embiid, he had some quote in the morning shoot around about how he had it circled on his calendar after that. So it would be very funny. Would also be on brand for the Sixers to have either no centers or way too many centers.
Oh yeah, that is a tradition in Philadelphia. There's no
Yeah,
doubt about it.
They somehow will have like too many centers and not enough centers at the same time.
It'd be so Suns too, though, to just stack these stars as they have.
Right, and you know, I didn't even like their Beal trade, to be honest. Though I mean, I'm like a huge Chris Paul fan, so already their whole offseason is suspect to me. But that is the one where, like, if you told me Harden gets traded between now and opening night and it's not the Clippers, and I had to guess who it was, that would be my guess, as insane as it sounds. Just because even if you think the pitch for Harden to Phoenix doesn't make much sense or is ill-advised, at least that pitch exists. Like, there is not really a pitch that exists for, like, the New Orleans Pelicans. It's just like the most random team I could think of. Why would that team want James Harden, given the context, given the age, given the injury history, given the way he's trying to force his way out right now and has been trying to do it specifically to one team, which, to be fair, Harden was successful twice in a row. He wanted to go to Brooklyn. He got there. He wanted to get to Philly. He got there. But I think Phoenix is the one that I would guess, just because, first of all, they're crazy enough to do it. And I don't even entirely mean that in a negative way. One could say that they're ballsy enough to do it. Like, you can frame it however you want. So if there was one team, I think I would guess Phoenix. As crazy as it sounds, as crazy as it would look, man, like Harden, Beal, Booker, Durant. I don't know what's happening except, like, bet the over on all of their games is all I would be able to say.
No, and maybe they do need a little bit of playmaking. Maybe Isaiah Thomas is intrigued by him. I don't know what he thinks about Harden, but stuff like that. And certainly Durant's intrigued by him, given their history in Brooklyn.
Yeah.
So, like, that's the kind of stuff driving decision-making in Phoenix. And that is the first team that popped into my head, too. New Orleans, it's interesting you bring them up just because they may be a team that wants to accelerate things a little bit. I just don't think they have what Philly would want in that situation. Yeah. Like, they don't have an Ayton that they can offload. And that's the other good thing about Ayton too, is the money more or less matches up there between those two players, Harden and Ayton. So there's not really a lot of other stuff going back and forth between those teams, because of course Phoenix doesn't have draft picks for the next decade. So
exactly,
that's where my mind went to. I do want to talk some Celtics here, get your thoughts on them.
Sure.
Before we get out of here this afternoon, because as much as a quarter or two sent Philly history in a different direction here, the East Finals and that awful Game 7 changed the Celtics pretty significantly this summer, with Smart going out the door and Porzingis coming in. They had a pretty substantial change this summer too. And I think they're going to sit here looking at what's going on in Philly, a team that did almost beat them, that gave them some trouble in that series, and be pretty thrilled that they might not be as big of a threat this year. But bringing in Porzingis, wanted to harden the front court against a team like Philly, against Giannis, those types. And I'm still working my way through it in terms of how I feel about this. Like, I don't love Smart going out the door. I have questions, as I think everyone should, about Porzingis. From a Philly standpoint, when you look at the changes the Celtics made for a team that already beat the Sixers and kind of had the Sixers numbers over the last 5-10 years here, how did you react to the things they did this summer?
So it's a good question. I think, first of all, I think the Sixers fans, at like any other Eastern Conference contender, I think their immediate thought is like, Marcus Smart being in the Western Conference is great. Like, this is awesome. This is gonna save us so much trouble. Obviously, Smart's a very good player. His connection to the fans, to the fan base there, in many ways reminds me of how people have been with Embiid here for a while, which is really significant. I totally get why many Celtics fans are upset about the trade. I do think, and there are always injury questions with Porzingis, I do think he had this weird kind of thing where sometimes in sports, like, everybody realizes at the same time that a player might be a little bit overrated, and then they all go a little bit too far down, and then the guy becomes underrated. And I think we could be at that point with him, just because I don't think there were many people actually watching the Wizards this past year, which is certainly understandable. I mean, he's a really good player and gives you a lot of optionality, like strategically. I think just the fact that you can reasonably play him at the 4, you could play him at the 5, whatever. If you want to do double bigs, you have 2 different bigs that can kind of fit alongside anybody. I think the Celtics are going to be better next year than they were this year, and I don't know if that's considered unpopular opinion in Boston right now. You would be able to speak better to that. But to me, the upgrade of adding Porzingis into the rotation is more valuable than the downgrade of Marcus Smart turning into Derek White and Derek White turning into Peyton Pritchard, if you know what I mean.
Right. No, I think the calculation behind it makes a ton of sense. It's almost impossible to look at this from a stats perspective, from a fit perspective, cap sheet, everything else involved here, and say this was a bad move. You just wonder the locker room implications, absolutely. The intangibles. Even with Porzingis, and this is a big question I had for you because I haven't looked too deep into it, but it's something I've heard about. How has he fared against Embiid? You know, that caliber of a center here, because I love Porzingis in a drop position in terms of covering space and, you know, working within a team construct defensively. But there is sort of a brute force defensively when it comes to Grant's ability to guard an Embiid type, when it came to Grant and Smart even guarding the Giannis's of the world, that I think you do lose a little bit with Porzingis because, yes, he's 7'3", he's got all the length in the world. But I have to imagine Embiid was able to just power through him a lot of the time.
Yeah, they haven't matched up, at least to my memory, as often as you would guess, considering how long they've been playing by now. But Embiid sometimes has struggled against guys who just have like insane length. And it's weird because like someone like Robert Williams has not given him a ton of trouble one-on-one.
Because he can go through him.
Right. Because Embiid early on in his career, part of the appeal was like he's doing Euro steps around people. He's so bouncy, like he's hitting jumpers, blah, blah, blah. And then what turned him into a back-to-back scoring champion and MVP is that he has this insane strike advantage against almost any player in the NBA. And Porzingis is included in that. So I think Porzingis, it does give them an option. And I really like having the option to throw different bodies at someone. And actually before a Sixers Celtics regular season game, actually, I asked Mazzulla in his pregame press conference. I asked him.
I'm sure he gave you a great answer.
yeah, he really elaborated a lot. It's great. But I basically asked him how much he values the fact that they had Smart, White, and Brogdon all as guys who they could, you know, credibly play as Harden defenders, even though Harden went on to cook Brogdon in the playoffs. And it's something that I think is really valuable when you're going up against any sort of real superstar. And so I think, I don't know. I mean, it's a tricky spot just because almost nobody is going to be able to stop Embiid one-on-one.
Right.
And as we saw recently, one of the only people who still can do it somehow is Al Horford, which is just incredible.
He's still in Boston, which I think is big. Yeah. At $10 million now.
Yeah, and that's such a value contract now, which is like a thing that I think people have completely glossed over. I'm sure you've talked about it, but my general point is Embiid, for the most part, like when you look at the guys who have guarded him the best, it's not these like incredibly strong players or insanely long players. It's like veteran types with really good timing who aren't falling for all of Embiid's fakes, who know how to defend and contest without fouling. And the first 2 guys that come to mind as guys who have stifled Embiid in the past are Horford and Marc Gasol. And I don't view Porzingis as that same sort of archetype of one-on-one defender. I think he's much more valuable as like a weak side shot blocker in the way that Rob Williams probably is too. But it can never hurt to have a legit 7-3 player on the floor, offensively and defensively. And what I've liked about the Celtics teams most in recent years, and why I really thought they were going to beat Golden State in the finals a couple of years ago and really like believed in that team the whole way, was because there are so many different looks that they can throw at you. You know, like they can be a small team with Tatum at the 4 and Porzingis at the 5 now. You know, they swung the series last year going to a double big starting lineup. Like they could run lineups with ridiculous spacing. They could run lineups with ridiculous switchability. So I think more than Porzingis helps against Embiid one-on-one, I would just say the optionality and the versatility that he gives Missoula tactically is probably the most important thing that I would say the most important way that the Porzingis trade impacts the Celtics and Sixers as a matchup.
I do have one more Celtics question before we end this. Before we do that, one more shout out to our other great sponsor, our official sports wagering partner here at CLNS Media, with a great offer this football season coming up. I think it's Eagles Patriots week 1, right?
It's a big one. You were going to be stunned to hear this, but I am actually a New England Patriots fan.
Really? How'd that happen?
Yeah. So my dad is from Boston, and when he got me into football, it was like, oh, the Patriots. Yeah, you love them. I love them too. But I'm young enough that like my first Pats memory was like the Matt Castle season. But yeah, I get a ton of crap for it here all the time for 15 years.
Especially once 2017 came around.
Yeah, being a Patriots fan in high school in South Jersey, right by Philly during that time was not easy. But yes, fun fact, I don't follow football as intensely as I do basketball and baseball. You can see the Phillies hat here, but I am a Patriots fan. And so that whole week leading up to week 1 will be interesting for me.
It's a great game for both sides. It's been a great pseudo rivalry, I'd say. It's not a massive rivalry, but there's always, I think, disdain between Boston and Philly
it's Philly Boston, and there are 2 recent Super Bowls. I feel like it qualifies.
Yeah, for sure. And from a basketball perspective, you got some futures going on right now, but basketball is still a little bit in the distant future here. Celtics plus 470 win it all. Sixers hanging in there despite this Harden stuff at 1,700 as the 8th best odds. So not a ton of movement there. I don't know where it was before this Harden statement this morning, but they're hanging in there. I guess they're Cavaliers Clippers kind of odds. So yeah, not super favorites right now. But the big thing at FanDuel right now, football coming, their offer, if you pick a Super Bowl future winner right now, you're going to get bonus bets every time that future winner wins during the regular season. It's an unbelievable offer, and it's at FanDuel.com/Boston. Head over there, get that. All you got to do, pick a future winner for the Super Bowl, and if you're picking the Chiefs, something like that, Eagles, probably not picking the Patriots right now, but one of those big favorites, you're getting bonus bets potentially 12, 13, maybe even 14 times this regular season. It's an amazing offer, and I'm not sure how long it's going to be there, but go get it now. FanDuel.com/Boston. Bonus bets every time your Super Bowl winner wins. 21 plus present in mass. $10 deposit required. Refund issued as non-withdrawable. Bonus bets. Head to gamblinghelplinema.org or call 800-327-5050 for 24/7 support. Last question I got for you, Adam, before we get out of here. Everyone had their reactions. Everyone fell out of their seats when they saw the number. What do you think about the Jalen Brown deal?
It makes me, if I were a Celtics fan, it would make me really nervous.
Really nervous.
And I think Jalen Brown's an outstanding player. I think he can be a very critical piece for a championship team, as evidenced by the fact that 2 years ago he was 2 wins away from doing that. And you could argue he was. I mean, you would be able to speak better to it than me, but from what I remember, he might have been their most consistent player in the finals. And I don't know if my recollection of that is true or not. I do think people freak out a little too much about the biggest contract in NBA history thing. Like that's, as the salary cap goes up, that's just going to happen every year now, really. His flaws are some of the ones that like irritate me in players more than most people. Just sometimes it's tunnel vision, the difficulty with ball handling. I think his on-ball defense can be very good, and I thought it was mostly great against Harden in the playoffs, but off the ball is just as important, and I feel like I watched the Celtics enough to say that he gets beaten off the ball quite a bit.
Yeah, it's not something people bring up often, but it's become a significant factor with him.
Yeah. But I don't know what the alternative is that's better than paying him, you know?
Right.
Why trade Jalen Brown if you know that this is a championship caliber team, which I think they proved a couple years ago. They even proved last year. I mean, they were 1 win away from being back in the NBA Finals. So my reaction to it is a little bit of like, oh boy, that's like a ton of money for someone with a few really noteworthy weaknesses. But he also has many more noteworthy strengths. Just unbelievable scorer. The tough shot making is ridiculous. The self-creation, fantastic. The athleticism, obviously. The on-ball defense, like I said. So if you draft a player and he becomes as good as what Jalen Brown is now, and then you just max him out with whatever he's eligible for, I just can't blame a team or a front office for doing that. Now, again, I do have some reservations about it just because, like I said, those are pretty noteworthy weaknesses. But he also has a lot of good players around him who can help, fill in the gap, so to speak. If this was they're giving Jalen Brown a super max with hopes of him leading them to a championship, I would have many more issues with that. But obviously, that's not what his job is. And so we'll see if they can play well enough that he's the second best guy on a championship team. I definitely think it's possible. I wouldn't even call it unlikely. But I would have a little bit of anxiety about it if I were a Celtics fan. But again, I don't really know what the alternative would have been, and I can't blame a team for wanting to keep a player who has turned into such a good player and seems to have a great connection with the fan base, especially after moving someone like Marcus Smart. So I get it. I have some concerns about it, but again, I don't really know what the better option was.
Yeah, and all of it comes together. Everything we've talked about here, like their shakeup was moving Smart. It could have been moving Brown, but they chose Smart, and we'll see what kind of impact that makes intangibly and from a leadership and even on-floor perspective. Like I do think them not having to throw the ball to Smart late in the shot clock when they key in on Brown and Tatum, that could make a difference here. And, to your point, if you want to keep them, which they should, I think there's a lot of reasons you would want to keep them. And there's something to being in that mix every year. And these two allow them to be right in that mix every year. You keep that for the next couple of years and see how it goes. So I think that's a strong argument in favor of it. The argument against it, and this is one I strongly acknowledge, and I think this summer I did think about moving Brown. I don't want to say more than I ever did before because I was pretty intrigued by the Durant possibility too. Yeah. But again, my mind went there again this summer just because this team's weakness and maybe even its fatal flaw is the ball handling dynamic. And Tatum's gotten better at it, still not amazing. Brown probably went in a wrong direction there this year. And to add a third point to this, which is where I have some pause about the Porzingis move too. I don't see how he helps necessarily here.
Yeah.
And so, they do have the players in place to compensate a little bit. Smart, I think, did. White does. Horford, they have some good playmaking bigs, and Porzingis has shown flashes of that too. But when you do commit $50 million to a guy like Brown, like, is White going to be here in a few years? Is Porzingis even going to be here in a year or two? It just centers
right, and that's
the weight of the playmaking weight, everything on Brown and Tatum going forward.
Yeah, and I should have also brought up the financial ramifications of it. Because they're gonna be over the second apron pretty much every year for as long as this run is going.
And I don't see that as a big, is that a big deal to you? I know that's something Philly's gonna have to consider too.
So to me, it's a big deal if you know deep down that you're not good enough. If you have a team that definitively can make a run, and I would call this team one that can definitively make a run, given they went to the finals, they were a win away from the finals, and over the last 2 years. Then I think it's something that's worth doing. It does make roster building tremendously difficult. You can't take in any extra money in trades. You can't sign buyout guys. You can even have your draft picks move to the end of the round if you violate certain financial thresholds multiple years in a row. There are a lot of really difficult ramifications. The NBA's goal was to stop these Warrior style super teams, and they did a hell of a job coming up with ways to prevent it.
But then two teams in the Celtics and the Suns did make big threes right after, so it's interesting if you went in the other direction.
Yeah, and it very well could be that in a few years we look back and there was a market inefficiency on stars right around now because everybody maybe panicked a little too much about the second apron.
Yeah.
Time will tell. But yeah, as there are concerns that I have about it, but how can you draft a guy and who becomes as good as Jalen Brown and then you don't want to bring him back? It just I can't really criticize the front office for bringing back a homegrown guy who's become, mean, he's super max eligible because he was an all NBA player.
No, and that's probably the tool you needed to keep him, prevent him from going to free agency, given the other extension rules there. So I'm in that boat. You have some nervousness about it after the last couple of years and how they ended, but you were still so close that you do want to stay in that conversation. He's Adam Aaronson. Great to finally have you on here, Adam. I still can't get over waking up this morning and just seeing that tweet. It really was something.
Because ever since this Harden thing, anytime I sleep in, I'm like, oh,
it's one of the most shocking quotes to just have laid out in front of you'll ever see.
I'm like, oh my God, I probably missed the Harden trade. And then I look.
But it's so him too. Remember him sitting at the podium in Houston just being like, this situation's crazy. I'm done. He's so frank about it.
It's very funny because Harden, in the aftermath of the Houston thing, in the aftermath of the Brooklyn thing, it's like, oh, I would never intentionally try to tank my value to a team and get them to trade me and show up in bad faith and cause trouble. And then when rumors started going around about the Sixers not trading Harden, then people were like, oh, you might want to remember what Harden did in Houston and what Harden did in Brooklyn. And it's a funny dichotomy to me that at certain points that's what it was, and at certain points it's not what it was.
And who's chiming in his defense today? Kyrie Irving.
Yeah, great. That's exactly what I needed was Kyrie Irving's input on this. But just because it wasn't already crazy enough.
Rights to Ricky Sanchez is where you can listen to and read Adam, and you can follow him on Twitter at SixersAdam. Like I said, great meeting you this year. Great having you on here, and I'm sure we'll talk again, and we'll be looking out for your reaction over on that side as well. Adam, thanks for stepping in here today.
Thank you.
And everybody else, of course, go support HelloFresh. The new code, HelloFresh.com/CLNS50. Go check that out. Go support them. And, of course, FanDuel.com Boston. Some reaction coming up right over on the Patriots channel right now. Patriots Press Pass, 6 o'clock, just a few minutes from now. They're going to be reacting live to the Ezekiel Elliott signing. So go check that out right now. It's about to get started within minutes. And we'll talk to you again later this week when the NBA schedule comes out. Can't wait for that. See you guys then.